Welcome back to Power and Politics on what is an historic day here in Ottawa, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announcing that his government will invoke the measures of the Emergencies Act for the first time since it became law in 1988. This is all to deal with the protests and the blockades. We're going to get some reaction now from federal opposition parties. Dane Lloyd is the Conservative emergency preparedness critic. Peter Julian is the New Democrats' House leader. They're both joining me live from Ottawa. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Lloyd, the Prime Minister, he said these will be focused and time-limited, focused to specific areas, reasonable and proportional to the threats that the country is facing, and will not use the military. What's your reaction to what the Prime Minister has announced today?
Well, I think one thing that I can agree on with my NDP colleagues is that this is a sign of a failure of leadership for the Prime Minister. Every opportunity that he has had throughout this situation to de-escalate, he has chosen to escalate the situation, to inflame and to divide Canadians. Today, we had a plan as Conservatives to put forward a motion to request that the government would vote in support of a plan to give Canadians a plan to get out of this pandemic. And I think that could have been a great opportunity for the Prime Minister to demonstrate his willingness to work with Canadians to, see a path forward out of this pandemic. Again, he chose, partisanship and chose to vote against that motion.
Mr. Lloyd, how could any Prime Minister vote in favor of that motion while protesters are occupying the streets in front of Parliament Hill and shutting down the most important trade artery to the United States? I mean, that's exactly what they want him to do. I mean, how could they? I couldn't imagine Prime Minister Harper agreeing to something like that in a similar circumstance.
Well, I think it's entirely reasonable that, all Canadians should expect that their government actually has a plan to get us out of this pandemic. That's entirely reasonable, whether you're for the mandates or against the mandates. I think we all want to see accountability from this government, and we all want to see a plan moving forward. We're not telling the government to cave into any demands. We're telling the government, look, put a plan forward so that Canadians can judge where we're moving forward as a country. And the government has chosen the route of no accountability, and they're choosing not to put forward any plan. We've been very reasonable. We've given them a 3-week timeline to come up with this plan. But they've chosen not to do that.
Peter Julian, what's your reaction? What are the New Democrats' reaction to the measures outlined by the Prime Minister and his senior ministers today?
Well, first off, I would say that real concerns for the last 2.5 weeks, the Prime Minister and the government has been missing in action. And we've seen this spread out across the country. And so that's why Jagmeet Singh last week triggered the emergency debate that finally has started to get things moving. But it never should have come to this, David. The municipalities should have received support right off the top. The government should have taken it with the seriousness that is implied, given the impacts of lost jobs right across the country, catastrophic, thousands of lost jobs as a result of these closures, and the impacts on the residents of Ottawa, for example, that have had to endure harassment and in some cases assault. I would disagree with the Conservatives. I think they've handled this extraordinarily badly. They put forward a motion that was for fundraising purposes. It wasn't any serious attempt to address this issue. And of course, many Conservative MPs have been endorsing what has had a profound negative impact on the citizens of Ottawa. So I think putting all of that aside, where do we move forward? Jagmeet Singh had his 4-point plan that he brought forward last week. Right. That continues to be valid. Some of the measures, certainly the issue of FinTrack and combating money laundering, that's something that the NDP has been pushing for some time. Alistair McGregor successfully got a motion through on Public Safety Committee to try to zero in on this source of foreign funds coming in to fund these. Very disturbing, I think, to most Canadians. So FinTrack is something that the government is finally taking action on.
What about, Mr. Julian, the other financial measures of freezing the corporate accounts of the truckers and stripping them of their insurance? I mean, that's essentially very much a move it or you're really at risk of losing it edict from the federal government. What do you make of that measure?
I think it's fair to say when a commercial trucker is violating what are basic laws, the municipal bylaws, for example, that there should be consequences. We've been saying that from the beginning. Where we are opposed, of course, is the use of military. And Jagmeet Singh has questions for the Prime Minister and has been asking a number of questions. We want to ensure that we bring this to a peaceful resolution. We wish that the government had started acting 2.5 weeks ago.
Right. So, Mr. Lloyd, I'll give you a chance to respond to what Mr. Julian said about the fact that Conservative MPs have been out endorsing the protesters and hanging out with them and taking pictures with them here in the downtown core, but also your specific reaction to these measures announced today in terms of the financial measures of maybe taking away people's commercial accounts, freezing them, and stripping truckers of their insurance if they don't get out of town, essentially.
Let me be clear, Conservatives are opposed to the blockades, and we're calling for an end to these blockades. It's unacceptable, what we saw at the borders, and we've been calling consistently for an end to those blockades. On your question about the finance, I actually sit on the Public Safety Committee, and we recently had FinTrack come in, and Deputy Director of Intelligence Barry McKillop came in, and he was asked repeatedly about this financing, concerns about the financing, and he said that there was no spike in suspicious activities. He said that that they're doing their job and that there's not a lot of concerns. There's no such thing as an anonymous donation. People have to provide their name and their credit card information through PayPal or Stripe. PayPal and Stripe have to report to FinTrack. GoFundMe doesn't have to report to FinTrack, but the
Right.
Canadian banks that receive the money from GoFundMe do have to report. So the pipes leaning in and out of these crowdsourcing websites all have to report to FinTrack. So, this government announcement is a lot of smoke and mirrors.
But, Mr. Lloyd, I just need to ask you a question, and we apologies because we've lost your picture here for a second. We still have your audio. But you say Conservatives are against blockades. Why does that only seem to apply to economic impact at border crossings and not like neighborhoods in the national capital being occupied lawlessly as every level of government agrees? I mean, why is it so hard for the Conservatives to take a position against what's happening in the nation's capital?
Well, I think we don't want to see blockades in people's neighborhoods. We don't want to see people being harassed in their communities. It's very important that we denounce those things and that we unite as Canadians, behind the right to peaceful protest. But at the same time, we recognize that these blockades at the borders and blockades in residential communities are not acceptable.
All right, Mr. Julian, a quick final 30 seconds. Your leader said today, even before the Prime Minister announced the specific measures, that the New Democrats would support the Emergency Act provisions if brought to the House of Commons. Has anything changed that position now that we know more or less what the Prime Minister intends to do?
Well, there were questions that were asked, and we're getting answers to them. We've been very clear that we do not want to see any military action. We don't think that's appropriate. There are some aspects, particularly around the financing, that we believe and have been pushing for years. And it's good that the government is finally taking action on that. But it's the overall plan that's vitally important, and answering those questions. And I think Canadians have had questions now for almost 3 weeks, and it's time the government started answering those questions. And the Prime Minister responded and answered fulsomely to the questions that people have, including in the districts in Ottawa that have been under occupation now for weeks.
Okay. Peter Julian, Dane, Lloyd, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.